The reason Jesus may not have directly opposed slavery was because he did not come as a politician. The Jewish leaders certainly had expected a Messiah who would come to crush Rome and liberate them based on their understanding of Old Testament prophecies. But Jesus said, "For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost." Jesus did not come to change the world politically, but to save the lost and redeem mankind to God. Do we not make laws with regard to moral issues? We certainly have laws against cold-blooded murder, which I will safely assume we can both agree is immoral as well as illegal. Why then do you continue to make concessions for slavery on this point? Even if Jesus came back to abolish the sacrificial, dietary, and judicial laws of the nation of Israel, he would still be bound to the moral law. Therefore, if slavery is immoral, then Jesus was dutifully bound to speak in opposition to it, regardless if this position was unpopular at the time. It does not matter if Jesus did not come as a politician, for slavery is a moral issue, and Jesus is well known for his moral instruction. So why weren't he and the apostles proselytizing against slavery and denying slave masters access to heaven for engaging in this practice? Because Jesus did not want the religion to become politicized? If that is true, and Jesus had the ear of every Christian slaveholder throughout time, but would rather let millions suffer under the oppression of slavery because he did not come to change the world politically, then Jesus was far from the moral teacher Christians make him out to be, and Christian morality is essentially bankrupt. However, slavery is a social injustice, not a political issue to be debated or voted upon, a fact that is curiously overlooked unless the slaves in question happen to be God's chosen people. God went to such lengths to free the Hebrews from bondage that he kills every firstborn child in Egypt, from princes to livestock. At least we can give God credit for being consistent, or rather indiscriminate, when it comes to acts of infanticide. But are we really to believe that somehow God cannot maintain consistency with his views on slavery? God certainly did not view Hebrew liberty from Egyptian bondage as a political issue that should remain untouched and allowed to be resolved on its own.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
If we are all God's children, why shouldn't all people enjoy the same rights? Christ came to unite all people under that message. No longer were the Jews God's chosen people, because Christianity was a religion for everyone, Jew and Gentile alike. So why wasn't God's position on slavery regarding the Hebrews in Exodus extended to all slaves, such as those found in the Gospels? The right to not be beaten, to not work without pay, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are human rights that all humans must be free to enjoy. The Declaration of Independence labels these as unalienable rights given to us by the Creator. But as we can plainly see, that is certainly not the case. God never extends these rights to slaves, and neither did the Founding Fathers. Christian men used the Bible as motivation and justification to enslave an entire race of people. Jesus had the opportunity to stop the practice of slavery in its tracks, to prevent the exploitation of millions of men, women, and children throughout history, but he did not. We are not talking about politics or social reform. We are talking about establishing a moral and ethical code of conduct that would ring throughout the centuries to come. Jesus knew his teachings would be written down and learned from, yet still made no attempt to circumvent the injustices perpetrated under slavery. If slavery is immoral now, then slavery was immoral in the past, unless I'm missing something and morality is completely arbitrary. Although Jesus did not speak in direct opposition to slavery, he did indirectly address slavery in the Gospel account of Matthew, as well as Luke with a parallel passage. Both of these verses are from the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus exposits the 10 Commandments and reveals that they are not about outward behavior, but inward intentions of the heart. If we are not to even bear false witness against a fellow man or woman, then logic would dictate that slavery would certainly not be acceptable. Jesus says, "He who hates his brother is a murderer." If hatred is seen as murder in God's eyes, then slavery most certainly is seen as nothing less than hatred. especially the kind of slavery you accuse the Bible of condoning and supporting. I don't think it's possible to find a more ambiguous verse than Matthew 7 or Luke 6 regarding the very clear issue of slavery. Although you cite Luke 6 as evidence that Jesus indirectly speaks against slavery, in Luke 12, we find a record of Jesus addressing the issue of slavery directly. But this passage does not support beating slaves. This is in the context of a parable, which were stories that Jesus told to help us understand spiritual truths. Another example of this would be the parable where Jesus likens God to an unjust judge. The point is not for us to see God as unjust, but to tell us to be persistent in prayer. Likewise, the parable of the master and servant tells us we should be on the lookout and be ready for Jesus' second coming. Believers will receive their reward. Unbelievers will receive their eternal punishment. Although it is a parable, Jesus himself directly speaks about the well-known practice of viciously beating slaves, and yet again denies himself the opportunity to condemn these actions. Notice how the parable does not address the immoral practice of slavery itself, but rather Jesus is using the practice of slavery to form an analogy between a slave master, or God, horrendously punishing his servants, or us, for not being ready upon his return. If Jesus was against slavery, would it not have made better sense to equate the practice of slavery with hell, and by not following God's word, the sinners are like slaves, toiling away their existence with no hope of escape? Then Jesus could have stated something like, liberation from slavery is similar to salvation through Christ. All men deserve to be free, and thus all men deserve their heavenly rewards, which can only be obtained by liberating themselves from slavery to sin. It took me 2 minutes to come up with an infinitely more applicable parable than Jesus. So why didn't Jesus say something to that effect? Because Jesus is excusing the practice of slavery. Jesus is claiming God will do unto us what masters do to their slaves. If God is within his limits to punish us for not following his word, then why aren't slave masters equally as justified? If that were not the case, and slave masters do not have the right to beat their slaves, then this parable would not make any sense. What if instead of slavery, Jesus used a parable of a prostitute and her pimp? Prostitutes that are not prepared when their pimps unexpectedly call upon them will be severely beaten. So too will you be punished if unprepared for the Lord's return. Does this parable make any sense? Of course not. Why would Jesus make reference to a blatantly immoral act in order to demonstrate a holy message? If Jesus believes slavery is immoral, then referencing the act of beating slaves in positive affirmation of the plans he has made for us would be a complete contradiction. However, we have many more passages regarding the unjust practice of slavery to choose from, which are neither ambiguous nor in parable form. For instance, take 1 Timothy chapter 6. Here we find very descriptive language regarding slavery. We see that slaves are treated as chattel, human animals to be placed under a yoke and made to work and serve their masters. In fact, if you're the unfortunate slave of a Christian slave master, you are commanded to serve them even better. How do you expect slaves belonging to Christian slave masters to ever get out of bondage? What would you have told an American slave master that used this passage to justify his right to own slaves? How could you possibly convince him otherwise? Nowhere are concessions made for slaves of Christian masters to become free men. In fact, this passage appears to explicitly speak against slaves ever obtaining their freedom. Now, I realize this passage also states that slave masters are devoted to the welfare of their slaves, but we have already discussed this issue. It does not matter if some slave masters looked after the welfare of their slaves or not, for this passage clearly justifies a practice that we have already determined to be unjust. If you want to justify the immoral act of slavery simply upon the grounds of how slaves were treated, then let's justify prostitution by how well we treat the prostitutes, and let's justify the practice of bestiality by how well we treat the animals. Consistency is essential with regard to morality. If we cannot be consistent in our understanding of moral issues, then morality is not fixed, it is not absolute, and right and wrong are completely arbitrary. Slavery was common throughout the Middle East, as far back as ancient Egypt, and if God had simply ignored it, then there wouldn't have been any rules on how to treat slaves and servants. Therefore, they would have no rights whatsoever. God's rules regarding slavery show that God cared for slaves. If God did not protect slaves and bondservants with his commands, then people who did want to practice harsh slavery would love to move into an area where there were no governing principles on the treatment of slaves. It would have attracted those slave owners like flies. Therefore, God's laws discourage such things. In giving laws to regulate slavery, God is not saying that it is a good thing. In fact, by giving laws about it at all, he is plainly stating it is a bad thing. We don't make laws to limit or regulate good things. After all, you won't find laws that tell us it's wrong to be healthy, or that if water is too clean, we have to add pollution to it. Therefore, the fact slavery is included in the regulations of the Old Testament at all assumes that it is a bad thing, which needs regulation to prevent the damage from being too great. Driving a car is certainly a good thing, but we place regulations on driving so it does not become hazardous. Safe food is also certainly a good thing, but we regulate how food is to be handled in order to prevent hazards to one's health. And this is also the same reason we have health inspections in restaurants. Laws develop in response to a need. Laws are not always there to limit bad things. We make laws to ensure safety when driving a car or handling food, not because these actions are inherently wrong. Likewise, regulations were placed on slavery not because the act itself was wrong in the Hebrews' eyes, but rather to regulate the practice so it would not become hazardous to the Hebrews engaging in it. If the Israelites had really viewed slavery as being a dangerously immoral practice, they would have completely outlawed it instead of merely making laws to regulate it. Indeed, all concessions in the Torah on the practice of slavery are only given to other Hebrews, but slaves from other nations never have any rights. Not only does the Bible provide laws to regulate slavery, Moses even attempts to ban slave traders in Exodus 21, where he states, "Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession." Yes, this was obviously a valuable law at the time, preventing bandits and highway robbers from kidnapping people and ransoming or selling them. But this passage does not, as you say, show Moses banned slave traders, for this passage is addressing kidnappers. You must look to the book of Leviticus to find laws regarding the slave trade, where Moses gives very specific stipulations by which to obtain kosher slaves. Keep in mind, the book of Leviticus comes after Exodus. There is no kidnapping going on here. These slaves are legally purchased from other nations or from foreign tribes living within Israel. How these slaves arrived on the auction block is no concern under Hebrew law, for these are foreigners. These slaves could have been kidnapped, captured in war, or even born into slavery. There are no regulations on how slaves purchased from other nations are to be initially placed into bondage. This is the most difficult passage for theists to explain, because it ticks every single one of the boxes under the definition of slavery. Slaves are to be inherited property that can be passed down to one's children. We are directly told how to obtain new slaves, as they are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. The passage also stipulates that we have the authority to rule over slaves, meaning they are controlled by a master and forced to do his bidding without any promise of reimbursement. Does this passage appear to place regulations on slavery because, as you claim, the fact slavery is included in the regulations of the Old Testament at all assumes that it is a bad thing? Leviticus is not trying to regulate the injustices of slavery, quite the contrary. It is promoting the practice while focusing the injustices onto people belonging to outside nations. Essentially what Leviticus 25 is telling us is that you can have slaves, just make sure they are not Hebrews. But if you happen to have Israelite slaves, do not be cruel to them. As we can plainly see, slaves taken from the nations around you, and temporary residents living among you, and members from their clans born in your country, have no rights as human beings. In fact, every instance the practice of slavery is mentioned throughout Mosaic law, preference is always given to fellow Israelites.